circulated asking for signatures. Did you?
I was not sent that letter. I read about it this morning in the Sun-Times, actually.
Best place to get your news. Yeah, I assumed as much. I think it was only circulated to...
There was a comment that it was signed by like 133 clergy and one rabbi. Well, I'm not that rabbi. What's circulated to us?
Cool. We ready? All right, just to get started, so we have it on the tape, could you state your name and your position?
Sure. I'm Seth Limmer, Senior Rabbi at Chicago Sinai Congregation.
Thank you. So, Rabbi, you lead a congregation yourself. As a religious leader, do you think that the response to the burning of the flag at this church in the Chicago area from religious leaders like Cardinal Cupich has been appropriate?
I think when it comes to the unfortunate demonization of the LGBTQ community historically, religion has played an oversized role in suppressing that community and delegitimizing that community. And I believe, as a Reform rabbi who have embraced the LGBTQ community for the longest of any mainstream movement, that it's our job to demonstrate that embrace and to make up for past offenses, which are quite literally on our books. And so whenever, I don't think just being passive is enough, but we need to be proactively embracing of the LGBTQ community. So when something as viscerally offensive as a flag burning happens, I think the response needs to be so far out in front of condemnation and saying this is not something that we stand for anymore as a religious group. That's a, God forbid something happened in my tradition, we would denounce it loudly, often, and be very clear about that. That's clearly not the decision of the church, but they might have different feelings about the issue than we do.
Do you think the response from the Catholic Church and the Pope in terms of just the faith itself as it's interacted with and sort of discriminated against the LGBTQ community broadly has been appropriate? I know there's some shifts recently.
I can only cast judgment on my own tradition in contrast, and in Reform Judaism, we recognize that in order to make up for past offenses, we need to change our behavior and do differently in the future. And that's what we strive to do. All the Reform synagogues in Chicago, and some of the conservative ones too, are very much LGBTQ friendly, have queer Shabbat and pride Shabbat, and want to demonstrate that whatever the past abuses have been, that's not where we are now. I think if there's a religious tradition at this point in time that isn't yet fully embracing things, they're saying something about where they stand. Every tradition's allowed to stand in different places, but if you're not out on the front lines of welcoming and inclusion, I think that says something about where you stand.
Within your own faith, have you had to reconcile, I guess, the spectrum of differences of opinion on issues like this within the spectrum from Reform to conservative to Orthodox?
So when working with other clergy partners of different denominations, absolutely, and there's a lot of agree to disagree. We have mutual respect, and we have some pretty well-known areas where we're going to disagree going in. I think internally it's different. My synagogue wants to be a house of prayer for all people and a place of learning and growth, but the one thing that we've articulated we won't tolerate is intolerance. So you're welcome to be within us, you're welcome to share your views, you're welcome to have a different approach, but if your approach infringes upon the humanity and dignity of someone else, that's where you lose your welcome, that's where you lose your pass to be a part of our particular community. And for us, we think that that's an important line, that we want you to be a part of us so long as you want everyone else to be a part as they are, as opposed to a different way. So differences of opinion become very different from differences of recognition of other people's humanity and humaneness.
How do you navigate those relationships and those conversations, I guess, with different congregations and other synagogues, even where you do have those strong differences of opinion in terms of what you consider intolerance? Do you find?
I think a lot of the times when you know you have a fundamental divide, whether it's over certain approaches to Jewish law with an Orthodox synagogue, approaches to female ordination with the Catholic Church. When I build friendships with Catholic priests or Orthodox rabbis, we don't go to combat over places where we know we disagree, and that's kind of doctrinal, because that's antithetical to friendship. If I have a really good friend who's a Bears fan, I'm a Giants fan. We don't need to talk about 85 or 86. We kind of move on. It's different when it's within my own house or within my own reform movement, where it's very important to make sure we stand up for what we believe in. And I've been a part of a group in the reform movement that drafted our transgender acceptance policy. That is, we're the largest religious denomination to have such an embracing policy of transgender, and I was part of a group that helped push us in that direction. So I think there's a difference between how you advance things in your own house, like how you teach your own children your values and make sure your family believes the same thing, versus how you interact with neighbors who might have a different approach and still are able to build on whatever common ground you do have.
It seems like your, well, Reformed Judaism and your synagogue specifically have a lot of great examples of success stories in making progress in terms of recognition and LGBTQ and trans acceptance. Obviously, there are a lot of different factors at play in any environment where people are pushing for that type of growth. But speaking broadly, is there a sort of a template in terms of how you approach changing things on an individual level, on an institutional level, that you, at least in your experience?
Yeah, I think that the template is you have to know where you stand, and we stand for inclusion, and then you have to constantly evaluate yourself and be willing to assess what you're doing well and realize where your weak points are. So even at Sinai, where we strive to be the best, we're involved in a year-long project to look at what we could be doing better for LGBTQ inclusion, because we recognize even if we're getting an A, we can get an A+. And even if we think, sometimes you think you're inclusive and you're sending the wrong subliminal synapses don't work, you're sending the wrong subliminal messages. So I think it's not just knowing your commitments, but being able to evaluate yourself critically and try always to be better at what you're doing. That's sort of our key for how we approach these kinds of issues.
In these moments of growth, have you had to navigate any tensions between pushing for what you believe is the best form of way to practice?
What's interesting is we're embarking on this year-long self-critical study with some other Reform and conservative congregations in Chicagoland about how we could be better, specifically on this question of LGBTQ inclusion. And as I was building the committee, we have different people on it, some of whom identify as LGBTQ, some who have family members who are, and some who aren't. And one of the women I asked to join the committee said, well, you're really sure you want to change as much as you need to? And that's a really good question. And yes, in a community, you have to figure out, well, how much do we need to change? What is that about? How do we create a place that is working for everybody? I don't personally think that there's ever a place where you can't be inclusive and embracing and make everybody feel good. It's a question of how you get there, how you explain it, how it's taught, and how you bring people around the conversation. So I think if you invest the time in bringing the community to a place, as opposed to telling a community, here's where you are, I think that makes a lot of difference.
Can you talk a little bit more about the practice of changing perspectives among the individuals within the community versus sort of big picture, changing the way you interpret or communicate these beliefs?
Changing individuals is a hit or miss activity. I mean, you get them in class, you get them in conversation, they come to a service, they approach you, either approach you with open inquiry or they approach you with pretty obvious anger. And you've got to figure out how to meet either one of those. And I think changing the public is a little bit less hit or miss. We need allies like the Chicago Sun-Times to get messages out there that if there's one church in Chicago that's burning a gay flag, are there 150 religious institutions that are embracing the LGBTQ community? And to say, well, it's clear where Chicago co-religionists stand for the LGBTQ community, and it's unfortunate that someone's an outlier, right? And that message is where media comes in, where unified letters come in that say, no, as religious leaders, we might say, you're entitled to your opinion, but we differ strongly, and we're going to be on record as saying religion stands with the LGBTQ community. And those things do have an impact on public opinion, and sometimes when people realize that that's where most religions stand, especially if you're an LGBTQ individual, you might be more willing then to walk into a house of worship of your own denomination because you saw them on that list and you realize they do care and they're putting their name on the line. So sometimes there's an interplay of the public and the inside in that kind of a fashion.
That's a great point. So do you think gestures like this letter that's being circulated, asking religious leaders in their congregations to sort of raise their hand and identify themselves as being aligned with this philosophy, do you think that they have an impact, again, on individuals?
They have an impact as long as they're heard. I've signed hundreds of letters in my career that my mother was very proud of. And I've signed a couple of letters that have made waves and made impact because they get out there. I think because we're in Chicago, where the Catholic Church is a major player, and because the Catholic Church is very hierarchical and has effectively one spokesperson, this is a different kind of an issue than if it were one house of worship in a much more deregulated branch of religious practice. So if negative attention has been brought to an issue, I'm glad that a lot of religious leaders are coming out and saying, no, we're going to differ, we're taking the other side. And hopefully that will be able to make impact on the general public's perception of where religion and acceptance are today.
Do you think the Archdiocese in Chicago should be doing more to respond to this incident?
I'll answer that question differently. If the Archdiocese wants to demonstrate that they embrace and support LGBTQ individuals and welcome them fully, they're not sending that message right now.
I know you mentioned that you weren't asked initially, at least, to sign this letter. Had you been, would you have signed it?
Depending on what it says, but likely a letter in support of religious traditions, embracing people despite gender orientations or things of that nature. Of course I would sign it. In this instance, I'd have to see the letter. If it was, I wouldn't want to condemn someone for their practice because every religion has different practices, and I'm not in the business of condemning someone else's belief, but in standing up for something, that's certainly an approach I would agree with.
How do you feel, I think we've kind of touched on this, but do you think that it is a significant responsibility of religious leadership to take political positions in every circumstance or in circumstances specifically like this one?
I go back to Aristotle on this one, where human beings are by nature political animals. We form societies, relationships, and hopefully work for the general improvement of those. I don't know a single religious tradition that isn't trying to improve and affect the wider community and the wider world. That's politics. That's what religion's about. So I don't see a dividing line between religion and politics. I think that we're here to, some of my Christian friends might say, create a beloved community, and our Jewish tradition would say to repair the world in the divine image. And if we're here to repair the world, we can't stay out of certain conversations because they're about politics. Politics is how the world gets changed sometimes. And I think it's our obligation as individuals, let alone whether or not we're clergy, to be involved in changing that world.
If you wouldn't mind, now you've seen
I'm not sure that I would sign that letter because it's telling someone else to do with their church. And I don't think I think that might cross a line. I need to examine it more. If there were a letter that stated, we believe you stand here and your actions make us think you stand there, which is it, or can you make it clear? That would be different. But I don't think that clergy of other denominations should be telling people what they need to do, rather in a spirit of community saying, if you want to be sending this message, this is the message that's being heard. There's a gap, and you might want to address that gap. So the particulars of that letter seem to tell the cardinal what he needs to do, how he needs to reassign a priest, the kind of investigation he needs to have. It seems a little bit more accusatory than communal in that fashion, so I'm not sure I would sign that letter.
Do you think that's a matter of, are your hesitations that it is, I guess, sort of like prescriptive or interfering with the sovereignty?
Well, I'll go to a different end of the gender discussion. The Reform movement has been ordaining women rabbis since the 70s. We were the first movement to do it, and I believe that should happen. We're the first movement to ordain queer clergy as well. I believe that should happen. I'm not going to take out an open letter to any Roman Catholic and say they should have female clergy or they should have queer clergy. That's not my call. I'm not a Catholic. And if they ask my opinion, I might share it with them. If there's a huge effort for gender equality or sexual orientation equality in the Catholic Church, and I'm asked, I might say, well, there's a gap between your ordination policy and this, but it's not my goal, it's not my job to tell the Catholic Church what their doctrine is. They have their doctrine, they're allowed to believe in it. And so that's kind of what is off about this letter. So the same way, it's not my business to tell the Catholic Church who they should ordain as priests, certainly not in an open and public letter without being asked. I don't think it's my job to tell them how to police and report about their own behavior that's not criminal. I think when it steps into the criminal realm, it's different.
It's a fair exception. So I know you do a lot of interfaith community building work. Is this, if I'm understanding correctly, a circumstance where you would say, like, this is a matter to be handled and reconciled within that faith independently?
I think if someone from the Catholic Church asked my opinion, I'd gladly share it with them. And probably off the record in a way that, when your friend does something that you don't necessarily love, you don't pull them in front of a party and announce over a megaphone how they could be, nicer friends, right? But you find the right moment if you really care about them. In this instance, and the reason why I'm doing this interview is because one very public religious institution in Chicago did something offensive and literally inflammatory to the LGBTQ community. And I feel the responsibility as a religious leader who wants to embrace that community